While Britain and America suffered disasters with airships, Germany's Graf Zeppelin went on carrying fare-paying passengers. The architect of their success was Hugo Eckener. He commanded the Graf on many of her flights. They were welcome everywhere.
It was chaotic. It was a carnival. Great fun. And there were big trapdoors in front which opened, and the ropes seemed to be quite remarkable. The way they seemed to roll down in the air and then open up to a huge cut-o'-nine toes. And then all my team, I love that, my team, made a dash and grabbed them and started running backwards. And I forsake my post, and instead of running backwards with them, I made a dive for the gondola because I wanted to get my hands on it. I wanted to be right there to get a grip on the actual airship itself. That's what I wanted. I found a spot there, grabbed the rails, and it turned out to be exactly under the window that Dr. Hugo Eckener, the commander, used to lean out, to sign autographs, to talk to reporters and everything else. You realise when you were looking at him, you were looking at the brains behind the Zeppelin. You were like a god to me looking up at him. There he was in command of a Zeppelin, a thing like that. Oh, terrific.
The Zeppelin company passed into state control under Hitler, but not Hugo Eckener.
Hitler didn't dare to touch Dr. Eckener because Dr. Eckener was so well known internationally. They held parades in honor of Hitler, and Dr. Eckener would walk in the parade, but he refused to say Heil Hitler. And Dr. Eckener refused to knuckle down to Hitler.
Nazi money completed Germany's greatest airship, the Hindenburg. Eckener had hoped to use helium, a non-inflammable gas, but America had a monopoly on it.
Because of Hitler, our government refused to give helium to Germany. And I'm sure it came from the very highest places. The president himself. Nothing would have ever happened to it if it had been filled with helium. Every time the Hindenburg would land from Germany, why, there'd be a flock of reporters and photographers come down from New York to witness this thing.
I enjoyed the trip tremendously. It was a real revelation. I realized that at last the commercial airship flying across the Atlantic can mean something.
We had a wonderful flight in a record time of about 50 hours from coast to coast. That is nearly half the time the fastest steamers need. I admit we had to make the flight under very favorable weather conditions, but I am convinced under all weather conditions, even on the most unfavorable, we will be able to make the flight in all regularity and safety. Thank you. Thank you very much, Doctor.
In 1937, the future of the Hindenburg looked promising. It was the last word in luxury, and Germany was the only country operating passenger services across the Atlantic until May of that year.
It's practically standing still now. They've dropped ropes out of the nose of the ship, and it's been taken a hold of down on the field by a number of men. The back motors of the ship are just holding it just enough to keep it from... It bursts into flames. Wait, get it started. It's fighting, and it's crashing terrible. Oh my, get out of the way, please. It's burning and bursting into flames, and it's falling on the mooring mast, and all the folks would agree that this is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's like 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the frame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the passengers screaming around it. I told you. Never talk to people whose friends are on there. I can't talk, ladies and gentlemen. Honest, it's just laying there, massive smoking wreckage.
There had been so many deaths. culminating in the disasters of the R-101 and the Hindenburg, that for many years passenger-carrying airships disappeared from the sky. Today, small helium-filled dirigibles are a familiar sight over many cities. Larger airships could one day provide surveillance platforms high above the Earth's surface as part of a country's strategic defenses. In the 1930s, the balloon was being rediscovered as a means of exploring the atmosphere. Auguste Piccard, a Swiss physicist, built a pressurized gondola. In 1931, he flew to 51,700 feet in the stratosphere and set a new world record. Like Coxwell and Glacier 70 years before him, it was an adventure. He stayed up overnight before landing on a glacier in the Alps. He broke his own record the following year and brought back information about the nature of cosmic rays and became an international celebrity. High-altitude ballooning in pressurized gondolas became an international endeavor. A race developed between the Soviet Union and the United States to set ever higher records. In 1933, Soviet balloonists set a new world record of 58,000 feet. America responded 2 months later with 61,000 feet. On the next Soviet flight, all 3 balloonists died when their gondola broke free and fell to Earth. The climax to the rivalry came in 1935, when 2 American military balloonists, Captain Orville Anderson and Captain Albert Stevens, set a new record of 72,000 feet. Their achievement was to endure until after the Second World War. In the 1950s, the stakes were even higher. The race was to get a man into space.
We didn't know just how to select a man to go into space. We also knew that when man go into space, that he'd have to have a pressure suit. We'd never had any real long-term exposure in a pressure suit. We also had very little experience on the selection of the atmosphere that we would want to breathe.
A great deal of research could be done in aircraft which could be flown to simulate weightlessness. But there were some tests which could only be done at very high altitudes using balloons.
We knew that when we go into space, that man was going to be getting outside of the capsule. We knew that he was going to walk into space. He was going to walk on the moon. We had never, ever done this. We had never, ever been outside of a spacecraft or anything with no pressure. And of course, the other objective was that once he got there, how to provide a means of escape, how to get back to the Earth in the event of a catastrophe at high altitude.
There would have to be an ultimate test.
I knew that if anything went wrong with that pressure suit, that I was dead.
Weighed down by his suit, a parachute, a film camera on his back, and breathing apparatus, Joe Kittinger was to ride an open balloon capsule to more than 100,000 feet and at the exact moment jump out.
The reason why we were there was because it was a balloon. There was no aircraft that would get us up to those altitudes to do these tests. And without a balloon, we couldn't have done it.
the balloon would rise almost to the edge of space, expanding as the atmosphere grew thinner.
I had to stay there for about 11 minutes while the balloon drifted over the exact spot that I wanted to drop. I had about 45 items that I had to go through on my checklist in order to separate from the capsule. I disconnect my kit from the oxygen equipment on the capsule. So I severed the umbilical cord before I jumped out. And it was a moment of truth. That was why I was there. So I was really kind of elated when it was time to go. And I started falling, and I was falling very rapidly. And I kept accelerating and accelerating, accelerating until I was faster than the speed of sound without an airplane at about 90,000 feet. But I fell into the Earth's atmosphere, got more dense, and I kept slowing down, slowing down, slowing down. And when the parachute opened, the opening shock was a relief because the experiment was over as far as I'm concerned.
Joe Kittinger jumped from 102,000 feet, almost 20 miles high, a record for a parachute jump, and likely to remain so for a long time. The contribution made by Joe Kittinger and his fellow balloonists to the United States space program ended in 1961 when the altitude record was set at 113,000 feet, testing suits for Mercury astronauts. That record still stands. Ballooning still attracts those whose sole purpose is the search for adventure. In 1987, Richard Branson built a hot air balloon to fly the Atlantic.
We're going to give it a damn good try.
The dream of crossing the Atlantic by balloon was almost as old as ballooning itself. But it had taken until 1978 for that dream to be realized by 3 Americans using a helium-filled balloon. The winds were the same, but the technology had changed. Branson used modern fabrics, gas burners, and radio.
It's not over yet. We've got the worst task ahead of us, landing the sea.
But you must have some sense of relief that you're over the big pond, anyway.
There's no doubt about that.
He touched down briefly in Northern Ireland, losing more of his gas supply. But he pressed on, trying to make his final landfall on the mainland of Britain. It was not to be. Virgin Atlantic drifted gently into the sea between Ireland and Scotland. Branson and his pilot, Per Lindstrand, had to be rescued by very modern methods.
Nita, I'm going to punch these 2 out of here.
Modern technology has made hot air ballooning a safer sport for all. Today, many thousands of people are able to enjoy the serenity, the adventure, and the mystery of the oldest form of manned flight. After 200 years, balloons still have the ability to draw a crowd and turn heads. Advertisers recognize this age-old quality in balloons. They've sponsored a wide variety of shapes and sizes, which would have been a strange sight in the days of the Montgolfier brothers. Today's balloonists, like Joe Kittinger, freely acknowledge the debt they owe to those pioneers.